Welcome to the First Person Politics Online Classroom. My name is David Rosen, founder and senior analyst at First Person Politics, a consulting firm specializing in political psychology. I founded First Person Politics to help political consultants, advocacy groups, and leaders take advantage of all that political psychology has to offer. As an intellectual discipline, political psychology dates back to the days of Sigmund Freud, but most of the field's greatest discoveries, hard-won insights, and experimental findings remain unknown to people working in politics and public affairs. I'm here to change that, and I want to help you become part of that change. Why are people liberal, conservative, moderate, or something else? Conventional wisdom treats ideology as a set of political attitudes and labels, but ideological beliefs and behaviors are far easier to understand, predict, and influence once we recognize that they come from a set of psychological motivations, known in the literature as right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. This seminar will explore what they are, where they come from, and how they interact with each other to produce the movements and belief systems that drive our politics. We'll also discuss some of the potential applications for political analysts and strategists. This lecture series is based on a webinar originally developed for the American Association of Political Consultants and presented on August 25, 2014. Many of the ideas presented there deserved further elaboration, which time constraints unfortunately would not allow. That webinar has been revised and expanded into this online lecture series. Whether you're revisiting this material or learning about it for the first time, there will be plenty of new material you've never encountered or heard before. In the meantime, welcome and thank you for listening. This lecture series is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 will explore the problems with the ways most consultants currently measure and conceive of ideology. Part 1 also provides some important background you'll need in order to see why a psychological model of ideology works better than the rationalistic one most people in politics use today. Part 2 will introduce the dual process model itself, along with the 9 instincts that drive ideological belief and behavior. Both the dual process model itself and the 9 instincts have an extraordinary array of applications for political analysts and strategists, issue advocates, and leaders, and we'll cover those applications in Part 3. Part 1 is available to you free of charge. Parts 2 and 3 can be accessed in the briefing room for a low one-time payment of just $12.95. Not only will you walk away understanding the psychology behind political ideology, you'll have a set of powerful new tools you can use for attacking opponents, connecting with generations, and persuading powerful lawmakers. These 3 lectures contain an entire semester worth of graduate-level political psychology material, but more importantly, if you understand them, they will continue to influence your strategic thinking and planning for years to come. We'll preview parts 2 and 3 in greater detail at the end of part 1. So without further ado, let's begin. Coalitions of the Motivated, Part 1, From Objects to Subjects. In Part 1, I'll address some of the more common ways ideology is currently measured and discuss why they're problematic. Next, I'll present some key findings from political psychology that point toward a new way of looking at ideology. In particular, I'm going to focus on the emerging picture of how reason really works. That's because we need to update our model of how reason works in order to see political arguments and ideological beliefs for what they really are. I'll conclude Part 1 with an exercise demonstrating how all of us inject an enormous amount of subjective interpretation into our perceptions of the world. It's these subjective interpretations that we need to be paying attention to when it comes to understanding ideology. Last but not least, I'll preview the material from Parts 2 and 3. With that agenda in mind, let's begin. Consider this. Political preferences, prejudices, and creeds are often formulated in highly rational form, but they are grown in highly irrational ways. That, in a nutshell, is the subject of these lectures. How are ideologies grown, and how do they drive political beliefs and behaviors? Traditionally, we think of ideology in rationalistic terms, as a set of beliefs or principles that guide political thought and behavior. I'm asking you to begin to shift from a rational model of ideology to an irrational one. Now, irrational doesn't mean crazy. It just means that it doesn't conform to the normal expectations of rationality. When something is rational, we usually mean it's informed, logical, evidence-based, goal-oriented, and aimed at producing some kind of optimal result. When something is irrational, it lacks some or all of those properties. Nevertheless, a great many things that are irrational may still be explainable and highly predictable, and that is very much the case with this new irrational model of ideology. Another way to look at what we're doing here is that we're shifting from an objective model of ideology to a subjective one. Subjective doesn't mean that we can't explain it or that it isn't scientific. When something is subjective, that means that it has to do with the subject, the person who is experiencing it, rather than the object, the thing or things that are being experienced. I am a subject. You, too, are a subject. People are subjects. Your chair, on the other hand, is an object. Your computer is an object. Your smartphone is an object, unless it becomes so smart that it gains self-awareness, at which point it, too, would become a subject by virtue of having achieved consciousness. If you look carefully at the traditional definitions of ideology, you'll see that most of the time we define ideologies in terms of objects. I'm going to argue that we should be defining them in terms of subjects, in terms of the people and the motivations behind them, and that when we do this, ideology becomes a whole lot easier to understand, predict, and influence. But before introducing this new model, which I'll get to in part 2, it's important to understand why the old one doesn't work. So how do most people measure ideology today? Common ways that they go about it. First, they might ask people which ideological group they belong to, hoping the respondents know enough to sort themselves into one camp or another. Sometimes they'll give people a list of options. Sometimes they'll leave the question open-ended. This way of measuring ideology is commonly known as self-identification. Second, they may come up with a set of principles and issue positions that distinguish one group of ideologues from another. Liberals are for higher taxes, conservatives are for lower ones. Liberals are for abortion, conservatives are against it. Liberals want big government, conservatives want the opposite. Responses to these diagnostic issue questions or to self-identification measures are typically mapped one of 4 ways. First, they might be placed along a single left-right continuum, ranging from very liberal to very conservative, with extremists at the far ends and moderates and other idiosyncratic views somewhere in the middle. Alternatively, they might use a 2-dimensional model. Both of the classic 2-dimensional models of ideology use a left-right spectrum for the x-axis. For the y-axis, one version adds a social and economic dimension, the other adds a statist and anti-statist dimension. The exact wording used to describe the y-axis may vary, but most 2-dimensional models revolve around one of these 2 things. Indeed, these are the models most of us use in casual conversation when we talk about social liberals and economic conservatives and so forth. One last option used for mapping ideology is called cluster analysis. It's a statistical procedure used to group people together who give similar responses. If you follow the Pew Research Center's work, this is how they do it. Cluster analysis can capture the diversity of the electorate in much greater detail, but the clusters can't always be placed along a 1-dimensional line or a 2-dimensional chart. These 2 types of measures and form mapping methods represent the most common ways of measuring and conceiving of ideology today, whether it's in academia, in the media, or in the political consulting world. All of these methods have major drawbacks that should lead us to reconsider their use. Among the problems are that ideological labels mean different things to different people. The same ideologies can mean very different things from place to place, from group to group, and from one era of history to the next. People don't always know what ideological labels mean and are attracted to labels that are the most popular. Liberal, for instance, is a dirty word for many people today, even though many of those same people hold very liberal views. Actually, the same was true of the word conservative in the mid-20th century. The meanings of ideological labels and terms are usually highly contested, and broad-based ideological measures gloss over these debates, which may be extremely important if you're running for office and have to get through a primary. These intra-ideological fault lines are crucial to understand and measure for anyone trying to assemble a coalition or break one apart. Traditional measures of ideology don't even acknowledge them, to say nothing about explaining where they come from. Another problem with the current methods is who they leave out. Broad ideological categories like libertarianism, environmentalism, and socialism. Brands like the Tea Party and the Blue Dogs. Niches like neoconservatism, the Christian identity movement, and Beltway centrism, as well as the thousands of ideological movements that have come and gone throughout history, and the thousands more that are still alive and kicking today outside of the United States. Traditional models of ideology, including cluster analysis, are at a loss to describe and explain the staggering diversity of ideological phenomenon actually present in the real world. They simply aren't up to the task. Here's another big problem with diagnostic issue questions. Political psychologists and political scientists agree that issue questions generally measure partisanship, not ideology. People who don't pay close attention to politics, and even many of us who do, often look to political leaders and groups we trust for cues and clues about what to believe, what side of an issue is the right one to take. Partisan cues in particular are very influential, and they frequently trump an individual's ideological beliefs. So if you're asking about issues and topics that have been in the news, the answers to those questions often tell you more about the respondent's party loyalties than about their ideological beliefs and commitments. As America's political parties have grown more ideologically sorted, it's getting harder and harder to tell the difference between partisan beliefs and ideological ones. And that's why issue questions aren't a reliable measure of ideology. But the biggest problem that all the traditional models of ideology share is that none of them say anything about why people believe what they believe and why they behave as they behave. Even cluster analysis still sorts people based on what they believe. Pointing to a list of attitudes, approved messages, and demographic niches doesn't actually tell you anything about why those messages are approved and where a group's beliefs came from in the first place. Two or more people who are against immigration reform may have very different motivations which led to that conclusion. Testing different messages on them won't necessarily reveal anything about what those motivations are. If anything, a person's favorite talking points may actually obscure what's really driving their beliefs. We need a model of ideology that tells us about people's motivations for a very simple reason. Knowing what people believe isn't enough to change their minds. Political psychologists have been studying political persuasion for decades, and they've all come to the same conclusion. If you want to win hearts and minds, you need to target people's motives, not their arguments. If all you want is to mimic public opinion, then by all means, focus on what people already believe. But if what you want is to change public opinion, if you want to influence the attitudes and behaviors of voters, donors, pundits, and leaders, you need to reach for why. Here's why we can't take people's political arguments at face value. Through extensive testing and experimental research, psychologists have learned that rationalization plays a major role in politics. What is rationalization? It's when people make up a story or an argument to explain or justify an impulse without really knowing where that impulse came from. Rationalizations usually sound like convincing justifications and explanations for why people feel a certain way or believe certain things. But when psychologists put them to the test in experiments, it turns out they don't have any real explanatory or motivating power. What the person argued wasn't truly influencing their beliefs or behaviors. Other things were, often things the subjects themselves weren't even aware of. Let me give you an example. It was only through controlled testing that psychologists discovered the power of partisan cues. Adding a single word like Democratic or Republican to a political message would dramatically change how people responded to that message. Yet the subjects in these experiments would fiercely deny that party loyalty had anything to do with their opinions, even when experimenters caught them in the act changing their minds in response to a party cue. It's not that the subjects were lying about their motives. They simply weren't aware of the unconscious processes driving their opinions, nor were they aware of the power that certain external triggers have over their own seemingly independent judgments. The subjects would concoct truly fantastic stories to explain their sudden change of heart, even though the only thing to change was the presence of a partisan cue. This process of making up a story to justify an impulse, that's rationalization, and in politics, it happens almost constantly. Our brains are like a black box, and over 99% of what happens in them occurs invisibly and automatically, sometimes faster than we can even form a thought, much less explain where it came from and why. Rationalization occurs because we really don't know what's going on inside our own heads, even if we've spent years in therapy and have PhDs in cognitive psychology. It's one thing to learn about the inner workings of our brains through experimental research and academic study, but that doesn't mean we can observe or experience these cognitive processes directly. The reason we all rationalize is because we don't really have any other option. The stories and justifications we invent to explain our emotions, reactions, judgments, and decisions help us make sense of our lives, even if, like fairy tales and myths, they don't have any real explanatory power. Here's the bottom line. Psychologists discovered decades ago that most political arguments are actually just rationalizations. They're after-the-fact stories and justifications we use to try to convince other people to agree with us, but which don't really explain why we believe what we believe. They're just talking points used to advance a cause. They don't hold any real psychological power or influence. Now, people do settle on favorite talking points for a variety of different reasons, and they will tell pollsters that they prefer certain messages over others. But in fact, their preferred messages aren't what's driving their judgments and decisions. Something else is. And this is why it's a huge strategic mistake to take political arguments and the messages that appear to poll well at face value. That said, if you know what to look for, you can spot the real motivations in the way people talk about their beliefs. This type of inferential work is the basis of psychological profiling, and it's one of the solutions we offer at First Person Politics. Rationalization is so prevalent in politics and in daily life that psychologists have had to throw out almost everything we once believed about how reason works. Most of the time, reason works less like a truth-finding machine and more like a rationalization machine. This new psychological model of reason stands in very stark contrast to the popular conception of how reason works, which is based on some very old ideas that haven't been updated in ages. In fact, the conventional wisdom about reason comes to us from the Age of Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries. If you aren't already familiar with what psychology says about reason, then you're probably using basically the same model of reason our founders believed in when they drafted the Constitution and created our system of government. So in a very real sense, that old model of reason is baked into our political system and our political culture. It should concern all of us that those assumptions are now turning out to have been wrong. But there's a much more urgent and practical reason for political strategists, advocates, and leaders to worry about the old model of reason. It's still the basic model most of us are carrying around in our heads. It's the working model that's no longer working. And if we assume this is how reason works, we're going to act as if this is how reason works. Like a broken compass, it's going to point us towards strategies and tactics for persuasion, motivation, and influence that will seem like they should work, but in fact don't. You can't free yourself from false assumptions if you don't even know what they are and why they're wrong. And that's why I want to walk you through the old model of reason before I introduce the new one, so that you can see how it may be leading you down the wrong strategic paths. According to the old enlightened model of reason, hard facts and evidence are supposed to be the foundation of everything we know, believe, and demand. And that's because the facts are knowable, fixed in their meaning, and indisputable. As the saying goes, people may be entitled to their own opinions, but they aren't entitled to their own facts. And the facts are what we can all agree on. In this model of reason, facts would give rise to general claims, principles, and arguments about the world, which themselves would form the basis of our beliefs. Beliefs or opinions might be colored by our own personal experiences and emotions, but they would at least be anchored in an objective assessment of facts and claims. It was assumed then that beliefs would give rise to our motivations. In other words, our hard-won knowledge would determine our actions. Reason, according to this view, was thought to be rational. People would form judgments and make decisions based on full and complete information, using careful deliberation and sound logic, free from irrational emotions, and people would generally seek an optimal outcome. Furthermore, people would be motivated to become aware of and mitigate their own biases and errors in reasoning. Reason was thought to be empirical. People would look to objective evidence and natural laws to determine what was true or false about the world, and would abandon and revise views demonstrated to be false. Some views, like religious beliefs, couldn't be tested or proved through empirical means, but most people would recognize the need for objective analysis and decision-making, especially in public affairs and government. Reason was thought to be autonomous. Judgments and decisions would be formed privately and independently, free from any external influences or corruptions. Furthermore, reason would guide our actions and drive our behaviors. Our conscious minds were assumed to be fully in command of the choices we make, large and small, throughout our lives. Reason was thought to be self-interested. People had the ability to calculate their own private interests and to act on them, and would be driven to do so. These interests would guide our actions in both the short term and over the long term, and reason would enable us to learn how to reliably go about achieving those interests. Reason was thought to be open. People might leap to conclusions, but would be willing to change their minds in the face of new evidence. And it was thought that our minds would always be open to new evidence, new ideas, and new ways of looking at the world. Indeed, reason itself would counsel that openness would generally lead to the best possible outcomes. And finally, reason was thought to be natural. It was assumed that people were born with an innate capacity to reason in all the ways described here, and that people were naturally inclined to use their reasoning faculties in these ways. Only the church, the crown, and other corrupting institutions could interfere with reason's awesome and virtually limitless powers. Reason would not only help us understand nature, but in time would give us complete dominion over it. Now let me be clear about something. Reason can be harnessed to work in ways that resemble this enlightened model, but that's not how reason usually works, and it's definitely not how it usually works in politics. In most people, most of the time, reason is neither rational nor empirical, neither autonomous nor self-interested, neither open nor natural, and the facts clearly do not drive our motivations. Over the past generation or two, savvy consultants interested in ideology and persuasion have updated this picture by making room for emotions, values, and message framing. But the basic template for how reason works hasn't really changed. We still argue with our opponents when we disagree. We still point to the evidence to resolve disputes. We still take people's claims, beliefs, and arguments at face value. We still act as if those things are the key to winning hearts and changing minds. We still treat people as if their own private self-interests are paramount. We still categorize and target voters based on their interests and beliefs. We still insist no one is entitled to their own facts, and we still try to reason with people as if they can be reasoned with. If the enlightened model of reason was right, then all of these things would work really, really well. So let me ask you, when you show your crazy conservative uncle the facts, or correct your liberal grandmother's false beliefs, does it change their minds? When liberals appeal to the economic interests of downscale conservative voters, do they suddenly switch allegiances? Has one side's talking head ever said to the other live on television, "You know what? I've been wrong all along"? Of course not. But we keep on trying to argue and reason with people because it seems like it should work. The enlightened model of reason is so deeply ingrained in our psyches and in our political culture that most people have serious trouble even imagining political discourse conducted any other way. Even when we add emotions, values, and framing to the picture, we're still being misled and misdirected by a model of reason that's more than 200 years past its expiration date. If we want persuasion and motivation strategies that work, we need a model of reason that describes how it really works in the real world, not how a bunch of old guys in powdered wigs imagined it worked. Actually, the simplest way to understand how reason really works is to reverse the causal chain on the enlightened model. Instead of facts giving rise to our claims, beliefs, and motivations, motivations are what drive our beliefs, claims, and facts. All of us see what we want to see, and our motivations are in control. Not only do our motives determine what we believe and what we perceive as true about the world, they determine which things count as facts and structure our interpretations of those facts. This motivated model of reason is dramatically different from the enlightened model, but it's based on decades of research into the psychology of reason, argument, and persuasion. Scientists don't just theorize that this is the way reason works, they can prove it. In fact, once you understand the basic model, you can observe these patterns in the people around you. And if you're particularly self-aware, you may even be able to recognize them in your own behavior. Reason is bounded. People have access to limited or incomplete information, and our cognitive equipment places a whole bunch of limits on our ability to organize information, analyze it, and make decisions based on it. Whether we're talking about memory, intelligence, or openness to new ideas, how much complexity and abstraction we can handle, or how much closure we need. Cognitively, all of us are a little different, and these differences affect how we reason. Reason is irrational. Reason is neither logical nor objective, nor is it necessarily oriented around achieving optimal goals. Errors and biases like loss aversion and the gambler's fallacy run rampant in the psyche, and reason is wholly at their mercy. When you have a few minutes, I'd urge you to look up the list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia, because you will be absolutely astounded by how erroneous reason can be. And that's before we even begin talking about the effects of ideology. Keep in mind, though, that none of these biases would be identifiable if they weren't also highly predictable. Reason is automatic. Most of what occurs when we reason happens lightning fast and outside our conscious awareness. The human brain is set up to make split-second decisions and immediately leap to conclusions, because for millions of years our survival depended on it. Let me demonstrate this incredible speed for you. I want you to recall something for me. Remember your first kiss? Before I even started this sentence, the memory had already popped into your head. Effortlessly and virtually instantaneously, the memory, or at least some part of it, became available and accessible. There are a myriad of high-speed automatic processes and biases just like this that never stop, even when we make the effort to engage in slow and deliberate reasoning. Reason is symbolic. A great deal of reasoning happens through metaphors and similes, associations and symbols. A few minutes ago, when I compared the enlightened model of reason to a broken compass, I was engaged in symbolic reasoning. Another closely related phenomenon is that much of reasoning takes the form of narrative. This is why anecdotes and stories from people's lives are always so convincing. This is also why it's nearly impossible to refute a narrative that has taken hold by arguing against it. If you want to challenge a prevailing narrative, you have to come up with a different, more compelling one. Symbols and stories aren't just tools in our persuasion toolbox. They are absolutely central to the way reason works. Reason is emotional. Emotions don't detract from reason. In fact, reason doesn't work without them. The way psychologists have learned this is both tragic and heartbreaking. In cases where people have suffered from birth defects or injuries that damage the emotional centers of the brain, these unlucky victims have displayed major, even catastrophic errors in judgment and decision-making. Imagine the damage you might do to yourself and to others if you couldn't experience fear or empathy. Now, to be fair, too much emotion can also be harmful to reason, as is the case with phobias. But too little emotion, and reason stops working entirely. And finally, reason is defensive. Reason acts more like a lawyer or a press secretary than like a scientist or an investigative journalist. Reason isn't there to help us discover the truth, though with effort it can be harnessed for that purpose. Instead, reason is mostly there to defend our point of view, protect our egos, and help us get what we want. And what most people want most of the time is confirmation and validation of what they already believe, think, and feel. Motivated reasoning isn't the only type of reasoning humans are capable of, but it is the type of reasoning that matters most in politics and public affairs. It is, of course, possible to shift into critical thinking mode, which works a little bit more like the enlightened model when it's done right. But critical thinking requires a certain degree of detachment and objectivity, and a great deal of cognitive effort that most people, most of the time, are disinclined to make. The bottom line is that this kind of rational, deliberative reasoning is almost by definition demotivating. And that's because in order to do it right, you have to make a great deal of effort to subtract your own motives from the equation. If you want people to get up off their couches and vote, give money, volunteer, and more, you need people to express and act on their motivations, not suppress them. The part about motivated reasoning that makes people the most uncomfortable is what it does to our understanding of facts and evidence, and the role they play in reason. Facts are supposed to be the objective meeting ground where we resolve our disputes, yet the evidence shows that people across the ideological spectrum really do pick and choose their own facts, and will interpret the exact same facts in very different ways that confirm and validate their own biases and satisfy their own motivations. It turns out that facts, and political objects of all kinds, are fundamentally ambiguous. This is to say that the facts, issues, policies, values, public figures, institutions, groups, places, and events that all make up public life don't have fixed absolute meanings. We human beings assign them meanings based on our own subjective biases and perceptions, and our motivations play a central role in which kinds of meanings we tend to favor. It's crucial to understand that we can't reason our way out of these disputes over meaning. And it's not just because the same facts mean different things to different people. It's because our motivations are in charge of our reasoning, not the other way around. Reason defensively reinforces the different worldviews and perceptions I'm going to show you once we get to part 2. This is why anyone and everyone with strong political convictions insists they're telling the truth, even when the facts don't seem to be on their side. And yes, plenty of people in politics lie as well and know full well that they're lying. But from their point of view, the lies they tell are necessary, justified, and righteous. Arguing over the facts with them is just as futile as arguing with a true believer. I hope this next slide will help you see how two subjects can encounter the same objects and draw radically different conclusions. If you spent much time on the internet, you've probably come across this image or something very much like it. How dogs think. You love me, you pet me, you feed me, you must be God. How cats think. You love me, you pet me, you feed me, I must be God. What I want you to notice here is that our two subjects, the dog and the cat, both experience the same external phenomenon. What's different is not how they were treated. The reason they come to such different conclusions has to do with them and not with any objective factors. Those differences are subjective. In other words, they adhere to our two subjects, the dog and the cat. But those differences are no less real because of it. How is it that 10 people can see the exact same speech and come away with 10 different conclusions about its merits, even about individual sentences and words in the speech? The speech isn't different, they are. Maybe people are a little bit like cats and dogs. When we talk about the ideological differences behind these varied reactions, ordinarily we conceive of them in objective terms, but we should be conceiving of them in subjective terms. Here's what it means to define an ideology objectively. Defining ideologies objectively means defining them in terms of phenomena that lie wholly or partly outside of the subjects who believe in them. Issues, policies, principles, claims, public figures, institutions, groups, places, and events are all different types of objects we use to define ideologies. Indeed, we define ideologies in terms of issues like terrorism, inequality, or race. We define ideologies in terms of policies like social security, prohibition, or tax rates. We define them in terms of principles like limited government, protecting the middle class, or sustainability. We define them in terms of the claims we associate with them, like American exceptionalism, that climate change is man-made, or that both sides are equally to blame. We define them in terms of the public figures we associate with them, like Elizabeth Warren, the Koch brothers, or William Jennings Bryan. We define them in terms of the institutions we associate with them, like the Heritage Foundation, the Confederacy, or Planned Parenthood. We define them in terms of the groups we associate with them, like millennials, Tea Partiers, or feminists. We define them in terms of the places we associate with them, like Stonewall, Dixie, or Inside the Beltway. And we define them in terms of the events we associate with them, like the March on Washington, the American Revolution, or CPAC's annual convention. Take an ideology like liberalism. We can list out all the objects that define liberal ideology. We'll usually define a liberal as someone who has one set of attitudes toward those things, and a conservative as someone with a very different set of attitudes toward those things. We could perform the same exercise in reverse, listing all the things that conservatives would support and that liberals would oppose just as strongly. But do you see what we've done here? We've defined ideologies in terms of a set of objects, and then measured ideology based on the subject's attitudes toward those objects. In other words, we define liberalism and conservatism and every other ideology in terms of all the external things that signify them at any given moment, things that, by the way, are constantly changing and contested, rather than defining those ideologies by the kinds of people who embrace and reject them. It would be like trying to understand the differences between cats and dogs by focusing on the differences between their owners, their playmates, their food, and their toys. Cats and dogs aren't different because they play with different toys and have different owners. They play with different toys and have different owners because they're different. Liberals and conservatives aren't different because they hold different attitudes. They hold different attitudes because they themselves are different. We need a model of ideology that captures and illuminates those character differences. Such a model would define ideology in terms of the subjective qualities and attributes that make people attracted to different belief systems, people, and agendas. Instead of using external objects as the frame of reference, this new model would define ideologies in terms of the adherents themselves. It would focus on the inherent differences between living, breathing human beings that precede ideological commitments, both chronologically and causally. This subjective model of ideology would focus on the motivations, biases, behaviors, judgments, perceptions, emotions, personalities, narratives, and meanings that drive ideological thought and behavior. This model would expect that ideological differences are reducible in most ways to character and psychological differences. And in point of fact, there's a huge body of evidence showing that they actually observably, measurably are. Shifting your focus from objects to subjects may sound easy, but it doesn't get any easier to see things from someone else's point of view. Each of us is highly motivated to see things in our own way. Recognizing that political objects are ambiguous and open to interpretation makes most people in politics very, very uncomfortable. And that's because it means acknowledging that your way of looking at the world might be wrong, that your truth might not be the only one, and that your understanding of the facts could be incorrect. It's one thing to recognize that facts mean different things to different people as an intellectual proposition. If you're like most people, right now you're probably thinking, oh, he means everyone else is subjectively interpreting the facts, but not me. I have access to the objective truth. But I'm here to tell you that no matter what your ideology is, you're just as biased as everyone else is, though maybe in a different way. That's a very hard thing to hear and accept. If it makes you feel defensive, that's your motivated reasoning kicking in. And that's a perfectly normal and healthy response. But in order to make the rest of this intellectual journey with me, I need you to be able to see how even your own perceptions, your actual senses themselves, are biased. To help ease you through the understandable discomfort of doing this, I've developed an exercise to show you how your mind deals with ambiguity and how you bring a great deal of subjective interpretation to your perceptions. When we move to the next slide, I'm going to ask you to use your imagination just a little bit as I tell you a story about the figure I'm going to show you. I want you to really try to get into the mood and focus on your feelings. Okay, ready? Here we go. A large man jumps out at you from behind the bushes. He's got a menacing look on his face and he's out to get you. How do you feel? If you're like most people, you get a flash of panic and a little bit of that fight or flight reaction. Your anxiety level goes up, maybe even to the point of fear. Your heart starts pounding, and there's a little rush of adrenaline, and your muscles tense up as you prepare to fight for your life. Okay, relax. You're not in any danger. Clear your mind. Here comes the next one. A bell rings. The crowd cheers as you and your opponent move toward each other in the opening match. Both of you have trained hard for this moment, and the winner will move on to round 2. How do you feel? Now that rush of adrenaline may still be there, and your muscles still tense up, but the initial anxiety gives way to something else. Is it a competitive instinct? Maybe your eyes squint a little as you size him up. You glance from place to place looking for a potential weakness. Ambition and determination start to take over. You're in it to win it. Okay, relax. Clear your mind. Now for this last one, instead of focusing on your feelings, I want you to focus on what the figure is doing and why. Okay, ready? Here we go. He's facing away from you. What's he doing? I didn't give you much to go on that time because I wanted you to fill in the blanks. One common interpretation is that he's defending or protecting you. Another common interpretation is that he's a circus acrobat of some kind, bent over, ready for you to jump up on his back. But there are plenty of other narratives you might have constructed. The point of this exercise was to show you how an ambiguous object can produce a variety of different reactions and responses. Notice how in the last scenario, when I left things more up to your imagination, your brain quickly and almost automatically toggled through several possible narratives about what was going on, some of which you probably found more plausible than others. That was your brain creating subjective meaning. Your brain does this automatically and all the time, not just in every waking moment, but while you're dreaming as well. When your brain encounters something ambiguous, it tries to make sense of it by connecting it to one of your pre-established categories of meaning and experience, and constructs a story around the ambiguous material to explain what's happening. The fact that you saw something resembling a human figure at all, rather than just an amorphous blob on your screen, is evidence of your brain interpreting your experiences based on the pre-existing categories and associations in your head. Psychologists have a word for these categories and associations. They're called schemas. Schemas are highly stable, highly motivating networks of associations that allow us to organize and find meaning in our knowledge, memories, impulses, and sensory experiences. Schemas are the fundamental interpretive structures our brains use to bring coherence to our perceptions of reality. Without schemas, our brains would be like a computer without an operating system, leaving us no way to make sense of our own inputs and outputs. Schemas begin to form at birth, starting with relatively simple archetypal notions like mom, food, and me, as well as basic relationships like object permanence and cause and effect. And then they gradually increase in complexity, abstraction, and sophistication. Once established and validated by experience, schemas are highly resistant to change, especially if they have deep roots in childhood. Parenting, social norms, and cultural expectations all play a significant role in determining which schemas will prevail into adulthood. Schemas are the psychological antecedents of what we in politics often refer to as messaging frames. If you're familiar with Frank Luntz, George Lakoff, and Drew Weston, this is old news to you. These guys showed us how the words we use in our political messages matter because they activate and deactivate different metaphoric and symbolic frames. So for instance, the terms estate tax and death tax are both talking about the same thing, but they activate very different associations in your head. Those networks of associations are your schemas, and your mind rebels against anything that violates one of your pre-established schemas. Now, what happens if the reality is ambiguous? When an object we encounter could fit into any number of possible schemas. Remember the dark figure we looked at a few minutes ago? There were any number of plausible interpretations of what the figure was doing, whether he was trying to kill you, attempting to pin you in a wrestling match, protecting you from aggressors, or getting ready to lift you onto his back. All four of these interpretations rely on different schemas, some of them fairly ancient ones like danger and competition. But I'd be willing to bet there's one interpretation of the figure your brain keeps coming back to. One schema prevails, and only one schema can prevail at any given time. Not just because it changes the details of the story and your reactions to the figure. It changes what you literally perceive, much the same way an optical illusion would. To see this illusion at its most dramatic, try imagining the figure facing you and then facing away from you. You can toggle back and forth between the different ways of looking at him, but you can't actually see it both ways simultaneously. Well, here's the thing. Most political objects are like this figure. They're ambiguous, or at least contain enough ambiguity that they can be interpreted in different ways. Even when the facts are the same, all of us are literally seeing different things. And it's because we have different schemas governing our interpretations of the ambiguous political reality. In part 2, I'm going to tell you what those schemas are and where they come from, and how they bias our political perceptions and demands. There are two schematic domains that govern our perceptions of political reality, and actually of the entire social world. One is called social dominance orientation, the other is called right-wing authoritarianism. Together, they form what political psychologists call the dual process model. In part 2, I'll introduce you to that model and show you how it gives rise to the 9 instincts, which are the direct psychological antecedents of ideology. In part 3, I'll show you the applications of the dual process model and the 9 instincts, and by the way, there are quite a few of them. I'll start by showing you how this new model can be used to describe current and past ideological coalitions and the different kinds of people who join them. I'll also talk about how the dual process model enhances our understanding of long-term generational change. We can use the model to correctly predict the motivations of current and future generations and forecast ideological climate changes in American politics. Finally, I'll show you how the dual process model and the 9 instincts can be used for strategic messaging and psychological profiling. Unlike traditional measures of ideology, the dual process model gives us all the tools we need to craft powerful messages that persuade and motivate voters, donors, pundits, and lawmakers. It also provides a wealth of psychological insight that can help candidates avoid becoming their own worst enemy and help campaigns develop devastating attack narratives against any opponent. Coalitions of the Motivated Parts 2 and 3 can be accessed in the briefing room for a low one-time purchase of just $12.95. The knowledge and strategic insights contained therein are useful to virtually anyone who wants political and social change, no matter where you stand politically and ideologically. That's because the dual process model actually works. Unlike the current models of ideology, which have a host of problems, the dual process model and the 9 instincts describe and correctly predict how people actually behave in politics. The dual process model is based on a short list of experimentally validated questions you can easily add into any poll, survey, or focus group. On the other hand, if you're interested in individuals rather than key target groups or large populations, you can analyze the content of someone's political remarks and infer their true motivations, whether it's a major donor, a campaign opponent, a powerful lawmaker you hope to influence, or someone else. It's time to start looking beneath the surface to see the powerful psychological forces that are driving our beliefs and behaviors. If you have questions, want more information, or would like to hire First Person Politics, please contact us today. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in part 2.